Hi guys, tonight we'll step into Paris as it was during one of its darkest and most unforgettable times, the years of Nazi occupation. You'll hear what daily life felt like when familiar streets changed, when food became scarce, and when fear and quiet resilience lived side by side. This isn't a tale of battles or politics, but of the ordinary people who carried on, finding ways to endure while the city they loved was under foreign rule. Before we get started, if you enjoy exploring hidden corners of history at a slower pace, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. I'd love to connect with you there. So let's begin, slowly, walking through the Paris of the 1940s. Paris in 1940 was still Paris, the Seine flowing steadily, the rooftops glowing in the evening sun, the cafes with their tables lined neatly along the boulevards. But beneath this familiar charm, everything had shifted. The German troops had entered the city in June, and overnight the capital became a different world. Parisians woke to the sound of boots on cobblestones, banners draped across their landmarks, and new rules announced in sharp, foreign voices. Life, as they had known it, was suspended. The rhythm of the city slowed. People walked with their eyes lowered, shoulders hunched, and conversations grew quieter. It wasn't that joy vanished completely. People still smiled, lovers still strolled along the river, but every gesture now carried a weight of caution. One never knew who might be watching. The first and perhaps most striking change was the sense of constant presence. German soldiers were everywhere, stationed at bridges, patrolling near the Louvre, standing guard at train stations. To some Parisians they were distant figures, to be ignored as much as possible. To others, their uniforms were an unbearable reminder of defeat. Still, there was no choice but to continue life among them. Shops opened, though their shelves grew barer each week. Cafes served drinks, though rationing quickly made sugar and coffee rare treasures. Queues became a part of daily existence. Women waited for hours with ration cards in hand, sometimes returning home with little more than a small piece of bread or a few potatoes. Children learned early to accept scarcity, turning meals into simple gatherings with whatever could be found. Despite the shortages, people clung to routines. Men continued to shave, women still styled their hair, and families gathered for meals. It was a way of resisting despair, of saying quietly that Paris was still alive. At the same time, an unspoken network of small kindnesses began to spread. Neighbours shared what they could, trading food, offering help, or simply lending an ear. In this muted atmosphere, silence became both protection and burden. Radios were tuned carefully, conversations in public carried only in whispers. Posters announced rules and curfews. Everyone knew what time they had to be indoors, and after dark the city felt emptied of its former spirit. Street lamps were dimmed, their glow restricted to narrow circles on the pavement. Walking home at night meant moving through long stretches of shadow, with the distant echo of boots reminding one that the city no longer belonged fully to its people. And yet, even in these conditions, the beauty of Paris could not be erased. The river still reflected the moonlight, the chestnut trees still lined the boulevards, and the bells of churches still marked the hours. For many, this contrast between the timeless charm of the city and the oppressive reality of occupation made daily life feel surreal. It was as if two Parises existed side by side, the one they had always known and the one they were forced to endure. Families learned to adapt in quiet ways. They reused clothing, mended shoes, and saved every scrap. Old traditions of thrift returned, but with a sharper edge of necessity. Children grew up faster, sensing the fear in their parents' voices, noticing the tension that never quite left the air. Even play had to be careful, muted so as not to draw attention. Over time, people adjusted to this new rhythm, though never fully accepting it. Each day carried small acts of endurance, standing in line, finding a way to stretch a meal, walking carefully past a patrol. These were the details of survival, the ordinary moments that made up the extraordinary experience of living in Paris under occupation. And so the city moved forward, step by step carrying both its charm and its sorrow. Behind closed doors, people whispered about the future, wondering when or if liberation might come. But in the streets they kept walking, one careful step at a time, through a Paris both familiar and utterly changed. The arrival of occupation meant that Paris quickly slipped into a life of regulations and restrictions, where every ordinary act was reshaped by rules. Signs in German appeared across the city, reminding citizens that they were now under foreign command. Cafes and restaurants still opened, but their menus shrank as ingredients disappeared from markets. People spoke often of food, because food was no longer guaranteed. Bread was rationed, butter was scarce, meat almost a memory. Queues became part of the daily rhythm, stretching along sidewalks in the morning cold, people standing silently with ration cards clutched in their hands. For many families, meals were transformed into acts of resourcefulness. Carrots became desserts, made into sweet jams. Roasted barley replaced coffee, and turnips appeared at nearly every table. Mothers learned to make soup from scraps, stretching every bit of nourishment for their children. Hunger was not only about empty stomachs, but about the gnawing uncertainty of tomorrow. Would there be flour at the bakery? Would the market have eggs? This constant question shaped the way people walked, talked, and even dreamed. Children, who once took sweets for granted, now celebrated the smallest treat as a holiday. In this atmosphere, black markets thrived quietly in hidden corners of Paris. A neighbour might whisper about butter obtained through a cousin in the countryside, or cigarettes brought by someone who had contacts with farmers. These exchanges were risky, but they carried with them a feeling of relief and defiance. To find real coffee or a bit of cheese was more than nourishment. It was a taste of the life that had been stolen. Daily life became a balance between endurance and small comforts. Parisians clung to rituals, setting a proper table even if the meal was meagre, walking to the bakery though shelves were bare, keeping their clothes neat though fabric was impossible to buy. These small gestures became a form of quiet resistance, a way to say, we will not let go of who we are. Outside, German patrols moved through the streets, their presence heavy but now almost routine. People avoided eye contact, crossed the street, or simply walked past with lowered heads. Still, the sight of uniforms never lost its power. It reminded everyone of the fragility of their situation, that freedom had been taken from them, and that silence was sometimes the only form of safety. Curfews shaped the evenings. After dark, Paris grew hushed, its cafes closing early, its boulevards empty except for the echo of boots and the occasional shadow slipping home. Behind shuttered windows, families gathered quietly, speaking in low voices, sometimes turning to the radio for news. The broadcasts in German carried their own weight, but the forbidden BBC transmissions reached some listeners who risked severe punishment to hear them. Those faint voices from across the channel brought hope, though hope was fragile and dangerous. The city, once a place of music and conversation, became a place of whispers and waiting. Yet in the silence, resilience grew. Neighbours shared, families endured, and the people of Paris carried on step by step through the long shadow of occupation. The rhythm of Paris under occupation was slow, careful, and filled with constant reminders that life was no longer free. Every day began with the sound of boots in the streets, German patrols moving with practiced order, their presence impossible to ignore. Shops opened with what little they had, and lines formed almost instantly. People waiting in silence, ration cards ready, their patience worn thin but their dignity intact. To live in the city now meant to accept scarcity as ordinary. Bread was dark and coarse, made from whatever grains could be found. Coffee was replaced by bitter substitutes, and children grew up tasting turnips and carrots more than sweets. Mothers stretched every meal, fathers tried to keep spirits steady, and everyone spoke about food with a seriousness once reserved for politics. Yet alongside this hunger, there was another kind of emptiness, the absence of familiar voices and laughter in public spaces. Conversations in cafes grew hushed, laughter was rare, and the famous chatter of Paris seemed to vanish beneath layers of caution. Still, people carried on. A woman might still wear a scarf carefully tied. A man might polish his shoes, not for vanity but for a sense of continuity. These were small affirmations that life had not been erased. Evenings were quietest of all. The curfew forced everyone indoors, and the city of light seemed almost extinguished. Lamps were dimmed, streets emptied, and the hum of music that once filled the air was replaced by silence. Families gathered around radios, careful to keep the volume low. German-approved broadcasts filled the airwaves, but some tuned their sets carefully, searching for the forbidden BBC reports. Those faint voices from abroad carried enormous weight, whispers of resistance and the promise of eventual change. It was dangerous to listen, but danger was part of daily life. Posters appeared constantly on walls, orders, warnings and announcements in German and French. They told people where they could go, what they could buy, when they must be home. They were stark reminders that the city was under control, its rhythm dictated by someone else. And yet, beneath this surface, Parisians created ways to endure. Some traded small goods quietly in hidden corners. Others found comfort in music played softly at home, or in reading books by candlelight when electricity failed. Children adapted quickly, their games simpler, their imagination sharper, finding ways to play with scraps or inventing stories to pass the long evenings. To walk through Paris during these years was to sense both survival and sorrow. The buildings, the river, the gardens, all were the same, but they carried a heavy silence. And within that silence lived the quiet determination of a city that refused to let go of its soul. In occupied Paris, time itself seemed to change. Days felt longer, stretched by the constant waiting in queues, the endless search for food, and the heavy awareness of being watched. The once vibrant heartbeat of the city had slowed into something muted, cautious, but persistent. Parisians adapted, as people always do, but adaptation did not mean comfort. It meant survival. Markets became places not only of exchange, but of rumours. Standing in line, people spoke in careful tones about shortages, about farmers in the countryside, about the possibility of finding butter, eggs, or even a piece of cheese. Gossip travelled as quickly as bread vanished from shelves. Sometimes the talk was practical, sometimes hopeful, and often it was simply a way to pass the time, to distract from the ache of empty stomachs. Families relied more than ever on connections to rural relatives. A package of apples or a sack of potatoes sent from the countryside felt like treasure, guarded carefully and shared sparingly. Some walked miles to barter clothes, soap, or even family heirlooms for food. The black market grew in these shadows, not as a glamorous underground, but as a quiet necessity. Cigarettes, sugar, coffee, wine. Things once taken for granted became symbols of luck, tokens of normal life found only at great cost. In homes, people adjusted their routines. Meat was almost forgotten, so meals centred on vegetables, grains, and inventive substitutes. A stew of turnips might be stretched for several days, bread carefully sliced into thin portions. Yet even in these conditions, tradition persisted. Tables were still set properly, candles lit when electricity was rationed, and conversations around meagre meals still carried warmth. For many, this insistence on ritual was a way of holding on to identity, of refusing to let hunger erase their humanity. Clothing, too, told a quiet story of resilience. Fabric was impossible to buy, so people patched garments again and again. Shoes were resoled until they could no longer be repaired. Children often wore hand-me-downs that had already served several others, their play marked by scuffed shoes and worn coats. Yet mothers still tried to keep their families presentable, combing hair, washing clothes in cold water, and making sure appearances reflected dignity even when resources were scarce. Beyond the material shortages, there was the constant presence of foreign soldiers. To walk past a German patrol was to feel tension ripple beneath the surface of ordinary movements. People kept their expressions neutral, their steps steady, their words unspoken. A wrong glance or a stray comment could bring consequences, so silence became a shield. Even in silence, however, there was defiance. A carefully placed flower, a whispered joke shared among trusted friends, or a simple decision to walk proudly through the streets. These were small gestures of resistance, quiet reminders that the city still belonged to its people. And at night, when curfew drew everyone indoors, Paris seemed to exhale. Behind closed shutters, families lit lamps, children drifted to sleep, and parents spoke softly about dreams of liberation. The city outside was dark and controlled, but within those walls the heart of Paris still beat. Slower, quieter, but unbroken. Life in Paris during the occupation was lived in the small details, in the quiet adjustments that people made each day. The Grand Boulevard still stood, the Seine still flowed, but the city's rhythm was altered, slowed by caution and scarcity. Morning began not with leisure but with duty. Standing in lines, searching for food, carrying ration cards like identity itself. Bread, dark and coarse, became the centerpiece of many meals, and people learned to stretch it with soup or vegetables. Sugar was replaced with syrups, coffee with roasted barley, and the taste of real butter felt like a memory from another life. For children, sweets were rare treasures, sometimes promised for birthdays but often impossible to find. The absence of these small joys marked their childhood as much as the sound of soldiers' boots in the streets. Families leaned on one another and on neighbours for support. A few potatoes shared, a jar of jam passed across a courtyard. Even the simple act of watching someone's children during a long queue became a gesture of solidarity. These acts were not grand, but they mattered deeply. They reminded people that kindness still existed, even when the world outside seemed ruled by fear. At the same time, silence became a form of protection. People learned to lower their voices in public, to speak in whispers when certain topics arose. Posters in German and French reminded them daily of rules, curfews, and punishments. Everyone knew that to break the rules, even in small ways, carried risk. Yet within their homes, Parisians clung to fragments of normal life. Families still gathered around tables, stories were told, and laughter sometimes slipped through despite the weight in the air. Books were read by candlelight, music played softly on radios, and children invented games to distract themselves from the emptiness of the pantry. The presence of soldiers was constant, and though most people avoided direct contact, their figures shaped the atmosphere of the city. To walk past them was to feel the reminder of defeat, to sense that freedom had been stolen. And yet within every careful step there was a quiet determination. Paris was subdued but not erased. In its silence and scarcity, the city held on to its identity, waiting for the day when light would return fully to its streets. As the months of occupation stretched on, Paris seemed to settle into a strange, uneasy rhythm. The grand city of light, once alive with music, cafes, and late-night gatherings, now lived under curfew, rationing, and constant reminders of foreign control. Each morning began with long lines in front of bakeries and shops, people clutching ration cards and hoping that shelves would not be bare by the time they reached the counter. Hunger was not a sudden crisis, but a steady companion, shaping conversations, decisions, and moods. A meal could be as simple as a watery soup made from turnips or carrots, sometimes flavoured with herbs if one was lucky. Meat became so rare that children grew up almost forgetting its taste. In place of coffee, people drank bitter substitutes brewed from roasted grains. Even small pleasures like chocolate or sugar seemed like treasures from another lifetime. Families adapted by becoming inventive. Mothers traded recipes, creating meals from scraps and leftovers, finding ways to make the plain taste special. Neighbours helped one another, sometimes trading food, sometimes sharing what little they had. In these exchanges, trust was essential, for the wrong word spoken too loudly could draw attention. The black market grew quietly in the shadows, offering butter, wine, or real coffee for those willing to pay dearly. To many, such indulgences were worth the risk and the cost, for they carried not only taste but memory. The memory of freedom and of life before occupation. Clothing, too, became a symbol of endurance. With fabrics unavailable, people wore garments patched and repatched. Shoes rosoled until they were little more than leather shells. Yet even so, Parisians remained determined to appear dignified. Women styled their hair, men polished their worn shoes, and families tried to present themselves as if normal life had not been erased. These acts, small as they were, carried weight. They were quiet ways of saying, "We are still here. We are still ourselves." The city at night told another story. Once famous for its lights, Paris grew dim under curfew. Street lamps glowed faintly, windows were shuttered, and silence replaced the hum of music and conversation. The sound of boots on cobblestones echoed in the dark, reminding everyone of the authority that watched over them. Families gathered indoors, often around radios. Official broadcasts filled the air with propaganda, but some risked tuning in secretly to the BBC. Those faint, forbidden voices carried hope across the channel, telling of battles far away, of resistance, and of the possibility that liberation might come. It was dangerous to listen, but hope itself had become worth the danger. Despite the fear, Paris was not without resilience. Small acts of defiance lived in the details: a whispered joke, a hidden flag, a neighbour who offered help despite their own need. These were not grand gestures, but they mattered deeply. They kept alive the idea that the city was not conquered in spirit, even if it was subdued in body. Step by step, day by day, Parisians endured, holding on to themselves and to their city in the long shadow of occupation. The seasons passed, and with them Paris shifted in subtle but unforgettable ways. Winter was the hardest time. Cold seeped through the city, and with coal rationed, homes were often chilly, their residents wrapped in extra layers, relying on blankets and candles to stay warm. People gathered in kitchens, the warmest part of the home, stretching meagre meals into long evenings where conversation replaced comfort. Bread, always rationed, became harder and coarser in these months, and vegetables were scarce. Families dreamed of summer markets, of fruit and fresh produce, though even then the harvest would never be enough for all. Spring brought some relief, but also new reminders of the unnatural rhythm of life. Parks that had once echoed with laughter and music were quieter now, patrolled and watched. Children still played, but their games carried the shadow of restriction, their laughter muted by the sight of uniforms nearby. And yet, the city bloomed in defiance, chestnut trees bursting into flower, the Seine sparkling beneath the sun. This contrast between beauty and oppression shaped the memories of many. To walk along the river and see life continuing in nature, while the human world was bound in silence, created a surreal dissonance. Summer offered light, but also tension. Cafes extended their tables, but menus remained thin, the once famous Parisian meals reduced to substitutions and improvisations. Still, people sat outside, sipping whatever was available, cherishing the warmth of the sun and the company of others. It was not abundance, but it was survival with dignity. Autumn brought harvest from the countryside, but much of it was taken by the occupiers, leaving Parisians to rely again on what little trickled through. Each season reminded the city that time was moving forward, even under control, and that life, however strained, could not be completely halted. Festivals and holidays changed too. Religious traditions continued quietly. Candles lit in churches, prayers whispered in pews, even as the weight of soldiers lingered outside. National celebrations were absent, replaced by muted gatherings that carried both longing and quiet hope. Families found ways to mark birthdays or anniversaries with the simplest gestures: a shared loaf, a handmade toy, a song sung softly. These were not grand parties, but they carried meaning all the same. Through each passing season, Parisians learned patience. They endured the cold, the hunger, the silence, and the watchful eyes around them, holding on to the thought that nothing, not even occupation, could stop time from moving forward. And within that slow march of days and months, hope was preserved like an ember, waiting for its moment to spark into flame. One of the most striking changes in occupied Paris was the silence. A city once alive with voices, music, and the constant hum of traffic became subdued. Conversations in public grew short and careful. Laughter was rare, and the sound of boots on cobblestones often replaced the familiar notes of street performers. Parisians learned to measure their words, for one never knew who might be listening. Even within families there was caution, as children sometimes repeated what they heard without understanding the danger it could bring. Cafes remained open, but the air inside was different. People still sat at tables sipping thin coffee or substitutes, but conversations were hushed, often drifting towards safe subjects: weather, family, the latest ration changes. Topics that once filled Parisian life, politics, art, ideas, were now whispered in trusted circles or hidden entirely. The walls seemed to have ears, and many lived with the quiet fear that a wrong word could reach the wrong person. Posters in German and French lined the walls of the city, blunt reminders of authority. They announced curfews, punishments, and rules that dictated daily life. Each one reinforced the sense of being watched. At the same time, radios became both a lifeline and a risk. Official broadcasts filled the air with propaganda, but those who dared tuned carefully to forbidden stations like the BBC, lowering the volume so only the closest ears could catch the words. To hear voices from beyond the occupation was to feel briefly connected to a larger world, to hope that liberation was not an impossible dream. The silence of Paris was not only fear, it was also resilience. In the quiet, people found ways to endure. Families read books aloud by candlelight, neighbours exchanged small comforts in whispers, and musicians played softly behind closed doors. Silence became a shield, but it also carried a weight, pressing down on the spirit of the city. Yet Parisians, known for their wit and spark, found ways to let that spark flicker even in muted tones. A sly remark, a hidden smile, or a quiet song hummed while walking home. These were gestures of humanity that no occupation could erase. At night the silence deepened. With curfew in place, the streets emptied early, and the city of light became a city of shadows. Lamps glowed faintly, windows shuttered tight, and the faint echo of patrols marked the hours. But within those darkened homes life persisted. Children whispered stories under blankets, parents spoke softly of the past and the future, and the silence, heavy as it was, also held the steady rhythm of endurance. Paris, even hushed, still breathed, still waited, carrying its identity quietly through the long nights of occupation. Daily routines in occupied Paris carried both comfort and tension. People woke early, not to linger over breakfast, but to stand in long queues that formed before shops even opened. Bread, always the focus, was rationed carefully, and by late morning shelves were often bare. Housewives clutched ration cards, hoping that this time there might be butter or perhaps a little meat. More often than not, they returned home with only the basics, enough to stretch for another day. Meals became a test of imagination. Stews of turnips and carrots filled bowls, soups were made thin to last longer, and bread was sliced into careful portions. Families learned to savour even the smallest taste of something rare. A square of chocolate shared among children could light up a whole evening, not for its sweetness alone, but for the reminder of a life before. Black markets filled some of the gaps, though quietly and at great risk. A neighbour might whisper of real coffee available through a cousin, or of eggs brought in from the countryside. These exchanges required trust, for prices were high, and discovery could bring consequences. Yet people still sought them, for food was not just about survival, but about dignity, about remembering that life could be more than hunger. Clothing told its own story. With fabric scarce, people repaired what they had, sewing patches upon patches, darning socks and polishing shoes long past their prime. Children often wore garments handed down through several siblings, yet appearance remained important. Women styled their hair, sometimes using simple ribbons in place of hats. Men shaved carefully, even when soap was hard to find. These efforts, small as they seemed, gave a sense of continuity, a statement that occupation would not erase who they were. Streets reflected this mix of endurance and tension. German patrols stood at bridges and squares, their presence constant but now almost part of the scenery. Parisians learned to walk past without looking, keeping expressions calm. Still, the weight of those uniforms pressed on every step. Curfew shaped the evenings, sending families indoors before night fully settled. Once alive with music and laughter, neighbourhoods grew quiet after dark, the sound of boots echoing louder than voices. Behind closed shutters, however, life persisted. Families read by candlelight, neighbours shared whispers, and the rhythm of survival continued. These routines, though stripped of abundance, carried Paris forward. Step by step, meal by meal, the city endured, holding on to its spirit even when freedom seemed far away. The presence of German soldiers in Paris shaped the atmosphere of every street and square. They stood at checkpoints, guarded bridges, patrolled near monuments, and moved in groups through the boulevards. Their uniforms, their vehicles, their voices in a foreign language, all reminded Parisians that their city was no longer their own. At first, the sight of soldiers was shocking, a daily reminder of defeat. Over time, it became almost ordinary, but never comfortable. People adapted by lowering their eyes, avoiding unnecessary contact, and keeping conversations brief in public. Yet beneath this quiet acceptance lived a steady current of unease. The soldiers themselves were varied. Some treated Parisians with indifference, as though they were simply fulfilling orders. Others sought interaction, frequenting cafes, theatres and shops. Their presence in social spaces created tension. For Parisians, to be seen speaking with soldiers could spark suspicion, yet avoiding them completely was impossible. Many chose neutrality, polite but distant, careful not to draw attention in either direction. Cafes, once symbols of freedom and conversation, now carried a dual identity. At some tables sat locals speaking softly, at others sat soldiers in uniform. Waiters served both, maintaining composure, but the atmosphere was changed forever. Parisians sipped their drinks quietly, aware of eyes upon them, their laughter stifled, their words chosen with care. The occupation blurred the boundaries of private and public life. Streets that had once felt safe now carried a weight. To linger too long near posters or checkpoints could invite questions. To be out after curfew meant risk. Even children, once carefree in their play, learned caution quickly. Games were quieter, often indoors, their laughter replaced by whispers, and yet daily life continued in its own subdued way. People still went to work, shops still opened, and couples still walked along the Seine. Weddings were celebrated, though simpler, with fewer guests and modest meals. Love stories unfolded quietly, sometimes in defiance of the atmosphere, reminding the city that life itself could not be silenced. Behind closed doors, conversations turned more honest. Families spoke of hope, of news from abroad, of rumours that travelled quickly through neighbourhoods. Trust was essential. One never knew who might report a careless word, but within safe circles people expressed what they could not say in public. The soldiers remained a constant presence, shaping the rhythm of Paris but never erasing its identity. For every uniform in the street there was a family gathered around a small table, a child whispering stories before sleep, a neighbour sharing what little they had. The occupation defined the city, but it could not define its soul. Paris endured quietly, its people walking carefully through each day, waiting for the moment when the streets would once again be their own. Cultural life in Paris did not disappear during the occupation, but it changed shape, muted and reshaped by restrictions. Theatres remained open, though their programmes were carefully controlled. Plays and concerts could be attended, but the content had to be approved, stripped of any message that might provoke resistance or pride. For some, attending performances offered an escape from daily hardships, a way to sit for a few hours in the dark and remember what beauty felt like. For others, it was a painful reminder that even art had been placed under watch. Cinema also became a refuge. German films filled the screens, but French classics and comedies were sometimes shown, giving Parisians the chance to laugh quietly together. In these darkened halls, the audience found temporary relief from hunger and fear. Yet everyone knew the reels had been chosen for them, and the presence of uniforms in the rows made the experience uneasy. Music, too, persisted in small ways. Street musicians were fewer, but in private homes pianos still played, radios hummed softly, and songs were shared in whispers. A violinist might perform at a family gathering, or neighbours might sing together on rare evenings when they felt safe. These sounds carried both comfort and longing, reminders of a freer Paris that still lived in memory. Writers and painters worked in quieter forms. Some wrote diaries, recording daily life with honesty meant for future eyes. Others painted scenes of familiar streets, attempting to capture what felt eternal despite the present shadows. Many hid their work, uncertain of when it might be shared. In cafes, the conversation about art continued, but in subdued tones, words chosen carefully so as not to draw attention. Even under occupation, creativity could not be extinguished, though it had to move in silence. Libraries remained open, and reading became another form of escape. People borrowed novels, poetry, and history, finding solace in pages that transported them beyond the city's walls. For students, study continued, though resources were limited and teachers cautious about what could be discussed. Still, knowledge flowed quietly, resisting the idea that thought could ever be controlled. For Parisians, these cultural fragments were more than entertainment. They were survival. They reminded people of identity, of traditions that could not be erased. Attending a play, listening to a song, or reading a book became acts of quiet resistance, affirmations that Paris was still Paris, even when silenced. The occupiers could dictate rules, but they could not extinguish the spark of imagination that flickered in homes, in concert halls, and in the whispered conversations of friends. Through culture, however restrained, the soul of the city continued to breathe. Religious life in Paris offered another thread of continuity during the occupation. Churches remained open, their bells still ringing, though the sound felt different under the weight of foreign rule. Many Parisians turned to faith for strength, lighting candles, whispering prayers, and gathering quietly in pews. Attending Mass was both a ritual and a comfort, a reminder that some traditions could not be taken away. Priests and clergy spoke carefully, avoiding words that might be deemed subversive, but their presence alone offered reassurance. The act of coming together, of kneeling side by side, gave a sense of unity that stretched beyond hunger and fear. Weddings continued, though smaller than before, often with modest meals and borrowed clothing. Couples exchanged vows in front of family and a few friends, their celebrations stripped of grandeur but filled with sincerity. Christenings, funerals, and holy days carried on, each marked by quiet resilience. These ceremonies were less about display and more about survival of spirit. They reminded the community that life, in all its stages, went on. Holidays such as Christmas and Easter were observed with whatever resources could be found. Families crafted decorations from scraps, baked simple cakes with substitutes, and gathered around candles when electricity was scarce. Gifts, when possible, were handmade: a carved toy, a knitted scarf, a painted card. For children, even the smallest surprise brought joy. These moments of tradition, though humble, carried immense meaning. They allowed people to hold on to the rhythm of the year, to believe that time itself had not been stolen. Cemeteries told another part of the story. Funerals were subdued, often attended by only close relatives due to restrictions. Yet the act of laying loved ones to rest, of placing flowers on graves, was carried out with dignity. It was a way to affirm humanity in the face of oppression, to say that even death would not erase respect. Faith also shaped quiet acts of resistance. Some priests and nuns sheltered those in danger, offering sanctuary in convents and hidden rooms. Others smuggled messages or food, risking punishment for the sake of compassion. These deeds were rarely spoken of openly, but they became part of the silent network that sustained Paris through its darkest years. For many, belief provided a sense of endurance. It was not always about miracles or promises of deliverance, but about the strength to face each day. In the quiet of a church, with candles flickering and voices rising in prayer, parishioners found a reminder that hope, however fragile, still lived within them. Religion became both a refuge and a declaration, a way of saying that identity, faith and dignity could not be erased by uniforms or decrees. For children in occupied Paris, life took on a different shape, one marked by absence and adaptation. Their schools remained open, but classrooms were changed by shortages. Paper was scarce, pencils shared, and books sometimes old and worn. Teachers did their best, though many avoided sensitive topics, careful with words that might draw suspicion. Lessons continued, but the atmosphere was quieter, more cautious than in years before. Recess in the schoolyards was not as free as it once had been. Games were played, but with fewer toys, often using scraps or homemade balls. Laughter still existed, but it was softer, carrying an undertone of restraint. Children were quick to notice the fear in adults' voices, the tension in their parents' eyes, and so even play seemed touched by the weight of occupation. Food was perhaps the greatest mark of their experience. Meals were smaller, treats rare, and hunger familiar. A simple piece of fruit or a bit of chocolate could become a treasured memory, spoken of for weeks. Children learned early to accept scarcity, to eat slowly, to make do with substitutes. Their childhoods were shaped less by abundance and more by endurance. Yet even so, imagination offered an escape. Stories told at night, games invented indoors, songs hummed under blankets, all became ways to step briefly outside of reality. Parents encouraged this creativity, hoping to shield their children from the full harshness of the times. Birthdays, though stripped of luxury, were still celebrated. A handmade toy, a knitted scarf, or even a carefully saved sweet could make the day special. Families worked hard to preserve these small joys, knowing that children needed more than survival, they needed moments of happiness. At the same time, children absorbed the rules of silence quickly. They learned not to repeat what they heard at home, to avoid asking dangerous questions in public, to walk carefully past patrols. Innocence mixed with awareness, shaping a generation that grew up faster than it should have. Still, they carried resilience within them. Their laughter, though quieter, still filled courtyards. Their drawings, though made with scraps, still showed dreams. In many ways, the spirit of Paris lived strongest in its children, who managed to find light even in shadow. Through them, families found hope, believing that one day their sons and daughters would grow up in a city restored to freedom. Childhood under occupation was not free, but it was not entirely lost. It was transformed, carried forward with patience, love, and the unyielding imagination of the young. The role of women in occupied Paris grew heavier as the years went on. With men absent, some prisoners of war, others forced into labour, women carried the weight of households, raising children, managing shortages, and navigating the daily struggle of survival. They became the steady hands of families, making decisions about food, clothing, and safety. The morning queues outside bakeries and shops were filled mostly with women, waiting patiently with ration cards in hand. Hours were spent in lines that often ended with disappointment, yet they rarely gave up. Returning home with even a small loaf of bread was a victory, and stretching it to feed a family required both creativity and resolve. They mended clothes tirelessly, patching garments again and again, turning old coats into new ones for children, cutting and reusing fabric until nothing remained unused. Soap was scarce, yet women worked to keep families clean, boiling water, scrubbing by hand, finding substitutes for basic needs. Maintaining dignity through appearance was as important as feeding the body. Hairstyles, scarves, and careful touches of makeup became quiet statements of resilience. Life continued, and beauty had not been erased. Beyond domestic life, women formed networks of trust. Neighbours shared food, recipes and news, helping one another through the long days. In some cases, women took greater risks, carrying messages, hiding supplies, even sheltering those in danger. Their courage often went unseen, but it was no less vital. In markets, they bargained, whispered about black market goods, and watched for patrols, balancing necessity with caution. They were guardians of silence, knowing when to speak and when to remain still. For children, mothers became the source of both comfort and discipline. They explained the rules of curfew, taught caution in speech, and reassured little ones with stories at night. Their voices kept hope alive, even when their own hearts felt heavy. For elderly parents, they were caretakers, ensuring that no one was left behind. Women also worked in offices, shops and factories, filling roles left empty by men. Though the pay was meagre and the hours long, their efforts kept parts of the city functioning. They walked home after curfew with hurried steps, balancing exhaustion with the determination to keep going. In all of these roles, women embodied resilience. They were not simply enduring, they were preserving the fabric of society, weaving together families and communities in the face of silence and scarcity. Their contributions were often quiet, sometimes invisible, but without them, Paris could not have held on to its identity through those years. Men in occupied Paris faced their own burdens, though their roles were often different from those of women. Many had been taken prisoner or sent to labour camps, leaving families without fathers, sons or brothers. Those who remained in the city carried the weight of responsibility under constant watch. For them, daily life was a careful balance between providing for loved ones and avoiding unwanted attention. Work continued, though wages were low and materials scarce. Shops opened with half-empty shelves, craftsmen worked with limited supplies, and offices functioned under new rules. Men walked to their jobs with steady steps, passing soldiers on corners, nodding politely but without warmth. Their presence in the streets was marked by restraint, each movement measured so as not to draw suspicion. Food shortages shaped their days as much as anyone else's. After work, many joined their families in queues, standing silently alongside neighbours, ration cards in hand. To bring home a small piece of meat or a bundle of vegetables was a source of pride, a way to contribute when choices were few. Evenings often found men mending shoes, repairing furniture, or finding ways to stretch limited resources. Skills became valuable: carpentry, tailoring, mechanical knowledge, anything that could extend the life of worn possessions. Fathers taught sons how to repair rather than replace, passing down lessons born of necessity. Silence was an expected part of their existence. In public, men avoided political talk, lowering voices when soldiers passed. Yet in private, many spoke more freely, whispering about rumours, about resistance, about news from abroad. Trust was vital, for a careless word could endanger an entire family. Some men withdrew into routine, protecting their households by keeping life as predictable as possible. Others quietly sought ways to resist, whether by sharing information, helping neighbours, or refusing to show submission in spirit. Pride was not shouted, but it was held firmly within. For young men, the years of occupation were especially difficult. Opportunities for study and work were limited, and many faced pressure to leave for forced labour programmes. Families dreaded the arrival of official letters, fearing separation. Some went into hiding, living quietly with relatives, avoiding patrols, waiting for a chance to escape. Despite these hardships, men continued to uphold dignity. They dressed neatly when possible, shaved even when razors grew dull, and walked with purpose. To carry oneself with pride was a subtle act of defiance, a reminder that identity was not entirely controlled. In their quiet endurance, men of Paris reflected the city itself, subdued, watched, but unbroken. The elderly of Paris carried the occupation in a way that was both heavy and quiet. Many had lived through the First World War, remembering its hunger and fear, and now they faced a second shadow on their city. For them, the silence of occupied streets felt hauntingly familiar, like an echo of the past returning. Yet they endured, drawing on patience and resilience shaped by long lives. Old men and women could be seen in the queues each morning, standing with canes or leaning on family members, waiting patiently for bread or vegetables. Their ration cards were as essential as anyone else's, though often they had less strength to stand for hours. Neighbours sometimes helped, holding places in line, sharing food or carrying baskets. Such kindness was vital, for the elderly were among the most vulnerable to shortages and cold. Winter was especially hard. With coal scarce, older Parisians wrapped themselves in blankets, sitting near small stoves or candles. Many returned to habits of earlier times, saving every scrap of fabric, darning clothes, using hot water bottles to fight the chill. Some spoke little, their memories heavy, but their presence reminded families that survival was possible, that Paris had endured hardship before. Grandparents played an important role within households. They told stories to children, passing on memories of the old city, of times when streets had been filled with music and light. These stories gave children hope, linking them to a Paris beyond occupation. Elders often soothed fears, reminding younger generations that hardships, though painful, would not last forever. Their words carried weight, shaped by years of experience. Yet the occupation also brought sorrow. Many elderly saw traditions disrupted, neighbourhoods changed, and familiar landmarks shadowed by soldiers. The city they had known seemed distant, altered by uniforms and restrictions. Still, they held on to rituals, lighting candles, saying prayers, sitting at windows to watch the river. These small acts anchored them in a shifting world. Some elderly faced the war alone, their children gone to fight or taken away. For them, neighbours became family, offering visits, a shared meal, or simple companionship. Isolation was dangerous, but community often reached across doors and courtyards to ensure no one was left behind. Though frail in body, the elderly embodied quiet strength. They reminded others of endurance, of how a city survives not only through youth and energy, but through patience and memory. In their calm presence, Paris found a kind of steadiness, a reassurance that identity could outlast even the longest night. Markets in occupied Paris became both lifeline and symbol of struggle. Once bustling with colour and noise, they turned into quieter, thinner places where scarcity was the rule. Stalls that had overflowed with fruit, meat and flowers now displayed only modest offerings, a few carrots, wilted greens, perhaps a sack of turnips. Housewives and children carried baskets that often remained half empty, yet they came each day, hoping for something unexpected. The sight of queues stretching along sidewalks became ordinary. People rose early, sometimes before dawn, to secure a place, knowing supplies would run out quickly. Patience was tested, tempers sometimes flared, but most endured silently, aware that everyone was suffering alike. Farmers from the countryside occasionally brought produce, but much of it was requisitioned before reaching the city. When eggs, butter or cheese did appear, they vanished within minutes, often at prices too high for most families. The black market filled these gaps. In corners of streets or whispered exchanges behind stalls, one might hear of bread baked secretly, of wine hidden in cellars, of coffee smuggled in small amounts. To buy such goods was risky, but it was also an act of preserving dignity. A cup of real coffee or a piece of meat on the table reminded families that life was not entirely stolen. Children often followed parents through these markets, learning quickly the meaning of shortage. They watched adults barter, heard the whispered codes of traders, and understood that meals required more than money. They required luck, trust, and persistence. Their small hands sometimes carried home the rare treasures, a loaf of bread, a handful of apples, a tiny bag of sugar. For many this was childhood, shaped less by toys and more by the weight of food baskets. Despite shortages, markets still held fragments of normal life. Stalls of flowers appeared when seasons allowed, their colours standing out against the greyness of the times. People bought them even when food was scarce, choosing beauty as nourishment for the spirit. This act, simple but profound, showed how much Parisians valued symbols of continuity. To bring home a bouquet was to remind oneself that Paris was still Paris. The atmosphere in markets reflected the whole city. Cautious, subdued, yet quietly resilient. Each exchange, each small purchase, each whispered bargain was more than survival. It was endurance wrapped in routine. Through these places, Parisians faced the reality of scarcity, but they also demonstrated determination, finding ways to carry their families forward despite the weight of hunger and control. Transportation in occupied Paris reflected the scarcity that touched every part of daily life. Cars were rare, their fuel requisitioned or impossible to find. Those that remained on the streets often belonged to officials or were used by soldiers. For ordinary Parisians, bicycles became precious. Families who owned one guarded it carefully, repairing punctures with scraps of rubber, sharing it between parents and children. To ride through the streets was faster than walking, but even bicycles were sometimes seized, so many chose to walk instead. Walking defined much of the city's rhythm. People crossed bridges on foot, moved between neighbourhoods slowly, carrying baskets or pushing carts filled with meagre purchases. Long journeys that once might have been covered by tram or bus now took hours. Shoes wore thin from use, and cobblers found their services in high demand, stretching the life of footwear again and again. Public transport did exist, but it was limited. Buses ran irregularly, crowded and often delayed, while parts of the metro remained open with restricted schedules. Soldiers were a constant presence there, their uniforms visible even underground. Passengers avoided eye contact, sitting quietly, their ration bags on their laps. The metro, once a symbol of Parisian life, became subdued, its conversations hushed, its advertisements replaced by announcements and warnings. Horses and carts reappeared in the city, a sight that felt like stepping backward in time. They carried goods from countryside to market, rattling through streets where cars had once ruled. Children watched them with fascination, while adults viewed them as yet another reminder of scarcity. Yet despite the shortages, Parisians adapted. Walking became part of daily endurance, and neighbours often travelled together, sharing conversation in place of convenience. The slowness reshaped time itself, turning errands into long journeys, making each outing feel like an effort. Still, there was resilience in this rhythm. People adjusted, planning their days carefully, conserving energy, and finding pride in their ability to endure. Even in these conditions, the city retained its pulse. The sound of footsteps filled boulevards, bicycle bells rang occasionally, and trams still clattered along certain routes. These sounds became part of a quieter Paris, one marked by scarcity but alive nonetheless. In this altered landscape, movement was no longer about speed but about persistence, each journey across the city reflecting the steady determination of its people to keep going, one step at a time. Work during the occupation carried both necessity and strain. Offices, shops and factories remained open, though often with reduced hours and scarce materials. Many businesses struggled, their shelves half empty, their workers uncertain of pay. Craftsmen improvised with what little they had. Tailors patched garments endlessly. Shoemakers repaired soles beyond their limits. Carpenters used scraps of wood to keep furniture intact. For many, the greatest challenge was not the labour itself, but the atmosphere of control. Every workplace carried the shadow of oversight, the sense that words and actions had to be carefully measured. Employers balanced the need to keep operations running with the constant fear of losing supplies to requisition or being accused of disloyalty. Farmers who brought goods into the city often found much of their harvest seized before it reached markets. In factories, production was redirected toward the needs of the occupiers, forcing workers into tasks that weighed heavily on their conscience. Some resisted quietly, slowing down their work, misplacing items, or finding subtle ways to reduce efficiency. Others had little choice but to continue, knowing their families depended on the wages, however meagre. For young men, work was complicated by the threat of forced labour. Notices appeared calling for workers to be sent to Germany, and families lived in dread of receiving them. Some complied, others hid, moving between relatives or taking refuge in countryside villages. Employers sometimes covered for them, risking punishment to protect their employees. Women filled many roles once held by men. They became clerks, shopkeepers, and factory workers, managing both household responsibilities and paid labour. Their presence reshaped the rhythm of workplaces, bringing resilience and ingenuity. At the same time, older workers brought stability, passing on skills and knowledge that helped families endure shortages. The commute itself was a challenge. With fuel gone and transport unreliable, workers walked long distances, often in worn shoes, carrying their lunch wrapped in cloth or simply a small piece of bread. Exhaustion was constant, but so was persistence. To reach one's post each morning was a victory of routine over despair. Yet within this difficult reality, people still found pride in their craft. A repaired chair, a freshly sewn coat, a loaf of bread from the baker. These small products of daily labour carried meaning. They showed that despite shortages and control, skill and effort could not be erased. Work became more than livelihood. It became endurance, a quiet form of resistance against the attempt to reduce life to mere survival. Health and medicine in occupied Paris reflected the same shortages that touched every aspect of daily life. Hospitals remained open, but supplies were limited, and doctors often worked with less than they needed. Medicines that had once been common became precious. Their absence felt sharply in times of illness. Families saved every tablet, every bandage, using them sparingly, often turning to home remedies when professional care was out of reach. Pharmacies displayed shelves with gaps, their jars and bottles filled with substitutes or watered-down solutions. To find aspirin or antibiotics was nearly impossible, and those who managed to obtain them through black markets paid dearly. Mothers kept herbs, teas, and old recipes close at hand, hoping they could ease fevers or coughs when nothing else was available. The sick were cared for at home more often than in hospitals, with neighbours lending knowledge and assistance. For children, even simple ailments carried greater risk. A cold could become dangerous when warmth and medicine were scarce. Parents watched anxiously, doing everything possible to keep little ones strong. Nutrition played a part in health as well, and with diets poor in protein, many grew weaker. Doctors advised rest, vegetables when available, and careful conservation of energy, though such advice was hard to follow when work and cues demanded effort. Dentists struggled too, with tools worn and materials scarce, leading to painful improvisations. Yet the spirit of care persisted. Nurses and doctors, though exhausted, remained devoted, treating the wounded, the sick, and the elderly with compassion. Their work carried both professional pride and moral weight, for they were seen as beacons of humanity in dark times. Illness reminded families of their vulnerability, but it also strengthened bonds. Neighbours shared remedies, lent blankets, or sat with the sick, offering presents as much as treatment. Religious figures sometimes visited the ill, bringing comfort and prayer when medicine could not. For the elderly, health concerns were constant. Cold winters worsened ailments, and without coal, many struggled simply to stay warm. Still, resilience carried them forward, supported by family and community. In these circumstances, survival itself was an achievement. The absence of adequate healthcare revealed the cost of occupation, but the persistence of doctors, nurses, and ordinary caregivers showed another truth, that compassion could not be rationed. Even in times of scarcity, Paris held on to its humanity, proving that while medicine was limited, the will to care for one another was inexhaustible. The cafes of Paris, long considered the heartbeat of the city, survived the occupation but in a changed form. Once they had been places of endless chatter, where artists, students, and workers debated loudly over coffee and wine. Now their voices were quieter, their menus shorter, their atmosphere cautious. Sugar and coffee were replaced by substitutes, wine watered down, and many dishes that once defined Parisian cuisine vanished altogether. Still, people came, not for the food, but for the feeling of normality. To sit at a small round table, to sip a drink, to glance at newspapers, even censored ones, was to claim a fragment of life before. Waiters continued their routines with professional calm, serving both locals and, at times, German soldiers. This uneasy coexistence created tension. Some avoided cafes altogether, unwilling to share space with occupiers. Others sat with their backs straight, ignoring the presence of uniforms, determined not to surrender their traditions. The terrace culture remained, though diminished. Tables outside filled with Parisians who lingered in the pale sun, exchanging soft words, watching passers-by. The joy of people watching, a Parisian habit, endured even when expressions were guarded. A smile or nod between neighbours carried more meaning than before, a quiet reminder of community. Inside, conversations were often limited to safe topics: family, weather, food shortages. Yet beneath the surface, cafes still carried whispers. Trusted friends might lean closer, lowering their voices to share news or rumours from abroad. Radios played softly in the background, sometimes broadcasting German-approved music, sometimes French classics, each song a reminder of what was allowed and what was forbidden. For artists and writers, cafes remained a gathering place, though their discussions were muted. Sketches were drawn on scraps of paper, notes written carefully in margins, as if the very act of creation was a form of defiance. The clink of cups, the scratch of pens, and the quiet murmur of voices blended into a subdued version of the old cafe life. Despite the shortages and the constant presence of watchful eyes, cafes continued to symbolise the Parisian spirit. They were places where people could sit, if only for an hour, and feel part of something larger than survival. Each visit was a small declaration that Paris, though silenced, had not forgotten how to gather, how to share, how to live. In the quiet of those rooms and terraces, resilience took shape, one cup at a time, carrying the city through its long and difficult days. The Seine, always at the heart of Paris, flowed quietly through the occupation years, its waters carrying both memory and endurance. Along its banks, life adapted to the new reality. The bridges, guarded by soldiers, became points of tension, but they also remained vital connections between neighbourhoods. People crossed them daily, eyes lowered, steps steady, the sound of boots echoing alongside the murmur of the river. Barges still moved along the water, though with fewer goods than before. The river, once filled with the bustle of commerce and leisure, grew calmer, more subdued, yet it continued to sustain the city, providing not only transport but also a sense of continuity. Fishermen could sometimes be seen casting lines from the banks, hoping to supplement meagre meals. For families lucky enough to catch something, even a small fish was a gift. Children leaned over the railings, watching the ripples, their imaginations wandering as their parents reminded them to be careful, to stay quiet. The quays, once filled with artists and lovers, became quieter walks, but couples still strolled there, hand in hand, whispering words of comfort. Booksellers along the banks adapted as well. Their stalls, though thinner in selection, still displayed novels, poetry and sketches. Parisians browsed cautiously, buying what they could, treasuring the escape found in words and pictures. To hold a book by the river was to feel, if only briefly, that life had not been entirely altered. The Seine also carried symbolic weight. Its steady flow reminded people that time continued, that no occupation could halt the seasons. In spring, blossoms fell into its waters. In autumn, leaves drifted down from the chestnut trees. These sights reassured Parisians that nature followed its course regardless of uniforms or decrees. At night, the river reflected dimmed lights, its surface dark and mysterious. Curfew emptied the banks, leaving the water to move silently under the guarded bridges. Yet behind closed shutters, people listened to its presence, a quiet reminder of permanence. For many, the Seine embodied the endurance of Paris itself. It had seen wars, revolutions, and triumphs, and it continued to flow, carrying the soul of the city forward. To walk beside it, to watch its current, was to remember that change was temporary, that Paris remained alive even in silence. In its calm movement, the river whispered resilience, a promise that beyond fear and scarcity, the city's heart would continue to beat. Education in Paris during the occupation carried both continuity and caution. Schools remained open, their doors welcoming children each morning, but the atmosphere was changed. Teachers worked with limited supplies, paper reused, pencils shortened to stubs, ink stretched as far as possible. Classrooms that once displayed colourful maps and posters now looked bare, stripped of anything considered unsuitable. Lessons focused on basics, reading, writing, arithmetic. History and politics were approached with extreme care, for certain topics were forbidden, and teachers risked punishment if they spoke too freely. Yet many found subtle ways to preserve memory. A phrase slipped into a lesson, a book passed quietly from hand to hand, a story told outside official hours. These became acts of quiet defiance. Children adapted quickly. They learned not only their subjects but also the unspoken rules of silence. They knew when to lower their voices, when not to repeat what they had heard at home, when to walk past soldiers without looking. Their innocence was touched by awareness, shaping them into observers of a world much larger than they could fully understand. Play in the schoolyard continued, though with fewer toys. A ball made from rags or chalk games on the pavement provided moments of joy. Laughter still rang out, though shorter, sharper, as if even play carried caution. Teachers, many of them weary yet devoted, tried to shield their students from fear. They told stories, encouraged imagination, and praised small victories. For children, the classroom became a place of stability, a rhythm that helped them endure the uncertainty outside. Parents placed great value on education despite the hardships. They sent their children with carefully packed lunches, often only bread and a vegetable, but with the hope that learning would carry them toward a better future. Evenings were spent with homework by candlelight, parents leaning over to help with sums or dictations, treasuring the normality of these tasks. Libraries, though limited, provided books for study. Students borrowed what they could, diving into stories of past centuries, poetry and science. These books became windows to other worlds, places untouched by soldiers or ration cards. For many children, reading was not just learning but escape. Through schools, Paris held onto its identity. Education continued, not as it once had, but enough to preserve the rhythm of growth. In each classroom, with chalk scratching on blackboards and children reciting lessons, there lived a quiet refusal that even under occupation, the future could not be erased. Entertainment in Paris during the occupation existed, but it was reshaped, carefully monitored, and always tinged with unease. Theatres kept their doors open, though their programmes were approved and censored. French plays could still be performed, but only if they were considered safe. The power of art to inspire resistance was feared, so scripts were chosen to avoid political hints. For audiences, however, even a light comedy or a simple drama offered relief. To sit in the dark, to laugh or cry with others, was a way of feeling human again. Concert halls also functioned, though with restrictions. Orchestras played both classical and contemporary works, and audiences filled the seats, hungry for music in a city that had grown too quiet. Some performances were attended by German soldiers, their presence a reminder of the tension behind the art. Yet for many Parisians, closing their eyes to listen meant escaping, if only for an hour, into a world where occupation did not exist. Cinema became perhaps the most popular refuge. Films offered both distraction and warmth, and even though German productions filled many screens, French films and comedies were also shown. Couples and families lined up outside theatres, glad for the chance to sit together in the glow of moving pictures. Children, too, found joy in cartoons, their laughter echoing briefly, a spark in the muted atmosphere of the city. Cabarets and nightclubs, once famous for their exuberance, continued in altered form. Menus were thin, shows simpler, but the spirit of performance survived. For some, these places represented an escape, though others avoided them, believing such pleasures during occupation were inappropriate. Still, singers and dancers carried on, their acts reminding audiences of Paris's resilience. Street entertainment was rare but not gone. A violinist might appear on a corner, a small group might perform in a courtyard, neighbours gathering quietly to listen. Coins were dropped into cases, not just for music, but for hope. These moments were fleeting but powerful, for they connected people through shared beauty. Books and reading also became vital sources of entertainment. Families gathered at night to read aloud, turning novels into shared adventures. Poetry, too, offered solace, its rhythm carrying more than words could say. Writers continued their work, though often in private, their manuscripts hidden until it was safe to reveal them. Entertainment during occupation was not about luxury. It was survival of the spirit. Whether in a dark cinema, a crowded theatre, or a whispered song at home, Parisians found ways to remember joy. These moments did not erase hardship, but they reminded the city that even in silence and scarcity, laughter, music, and stories could still live. News and information in occupied Paris became both precious and dangerous. Official newspapers continued to circulate, printed under the supervision of German authorities. Their pages were filled with propaganda, articles carefully designed to shape opinion and suppress hope. Many Parisians read them only to know what was permitted, never trusting the words. Between the lines, they searched for hints, trying to piece together the truth hidden beneath official claims. Headlines spoke of victories, of order, of cooperation, but the people of Paris knew better. Rumours became as important as print. In markets, in queues, in whispered conversations at cafes, people shared fragments of information. A battle lost far away, an uprising in another country, a bombing raid on Germany. These rumours, though unverified, travelled quickly, filling the gaps left by censored news. Some turned out to be false, but others gave hope, sustaining spirits through the long months. Radios were the most dangerous but also the most vital source. Official broadcasts played daily, their voices stern and controlled. Yet many households secretly tuned their dials, searching for the faint signal of the BBC. To hear the English language crackle through the static was to feel a connection to freedom. Families gathered close, windows shut, volume low, straining to catch every word. The risk was enormous. If discovered, punishment could be severe. Still, people listened, because truth was worth the danger. Leaflets sometimes appeared mysteriously, slipped under doors or pasted quickly to walls. They carried messages of resistance, of hope, of solidarity. Though many were torn down within hours, they spread courage in their brief existence. To see such a leaflet was to know that others had not given up. Letters from relatives abroad were rare and often censored, their lines blacked out, their words altered. Families read between the gaps, guessing what was unsaid. Still, even a heavily censored letter was treasured, proof that loved ones were alive. For those with connections to the countryside, news travelled more freely. Farmers and travellers brought stories of the front, of shortages elsewhere, of the changing tide of war. These voices, though uncertain, carried weight, reminding Parisians that the world beyond their city was still moving. Information became more than knowledge. It was survival. It gave people direction, hope, and patience. Even in silence, the city was listening, piecing together fragments of truth from rumours, broadcasts, and whispers. In this way, Paris endured not only with bread and water, but with words, carrying its people forward through the long uncertainty of occupation. The resistance in Paris did not begin as a single movement, but as scattered sparks of defiance. At first, it was small acts, tearing down posters, writing slogans in chalk on walls, passing forbidden leaflets from hand to hand. These gestures may have seemed minor, yet each carried enormous risk. To resist openly was to invite punishment, and so secrecy became the foundation. Networks slowly formed, made up of students, workers, and ordinary citizens who refused to accept silence. They shared information, smuggled papers, and spread messages of hope. A hidden printing press might produce hundreds of copies of an underground newspaper. Its words passed through the city in folded pockets and whispered exchanges. For those who read them, these pages were lifelines, proof that courage still lived in Paris. The resistance also relied on symbols. The simple letter V for victory appeared on walls, sometimes painted quickly at night, sometimes scratched into wood. These marks reminded Parisians that the occupiers were not all powerful, that the spirit of freedom had not vanished. Students played a key role, their youth fueling daring actions. Some carried messages across the city, using bicycles to slip through checkpoints. Others distributed leaflets, their hands trembling but determined. Women, too, became essential, often underestimated by soldiers. They carried notes hidden in baskets, food concealed under clothing, sometimes sheltering those hunted. The black market occasionally crossed with the resistance, providing food or resources for those in hiding. Small groups operated in secrecy, each knowing only what was necessary to protect others. Trust was vital, and betrayal was always a fear. Yet despite danger, the movement grew. Whispered news of sabotage, railways disrupted, equipment damaged, spread quietly, giving hope to those who heard. For many Parisians, even if they were not directly involved, knowledge of resistance lifted spirits. To hear that someone had dared, that small victories existed, was enough to inspire patience. Punishments for resistance were harsh, but the willingness to risk showed that occupation could not erase courage. The resistance was not only about fighting with weapons, but about preserving dignity, refusing to let the city's soul be subdued. These early acts, fragile but powerful, became the roots of a larger movement that would later rise with greater strength. In these years of silence, the resistance was a whisper in the dark, but it was a whisper that carried, spreading strength through Paris one act at a time. Fear was a constant companion in occupied Paris, shaping the way people walked, spoke, and even thought. The sound of boots in the street could make hearts race. A knock at the door could freeze a family in silence. Everyone knew that suspicion could fall quickly, and punishment could be severe. Posters reminded citizens daily of the rules, listing curfews, fines, and threats of imprisonment. Their blunt language left no room for comfort. Parisians learned to read them without showing emotion, then passed by quickly. At night, the city grew especially tense. With curfew in place, shutters closed early, streets emptied, and silence pressed heavily on neighbourhoods. Families whispered by candlelight, listening for footsteps outside. A car stopping nearby, a knock echoing down the street. Even the creak of stairs could send waves of fear through a household. Many people avoided speaking names in public, even of friends or neighbours, for one never knew who might overhear. Trust was fragile and caution was second nature. Children, too, sensed this fear. Parents told them what not to say, teaching silence as a form of protection. Games were quieter, questions were answered with care, and innocence gave way to watchfulness. Still, children sometimes repeated what they heard at home, and parents lived with the constant worry of loose words reaching the wrong ears. Arrests were not daily for every family, but their possibility hung over everyone. To see someone taken away, to hear of a neighbour who vanished overnight, reminded people that safety was fragile. Rumours spread quickly, each story feeding the atmosphere of unease. Yet fear, though heavy, did not destroy resilience. People learned to move carefully, to find strength in routine. A mother baking bread, a father repairing shoes, a child studying by lamplight. These acts became shields against despair. Faith too offered comfort. Candles in churches, prayers whispered in pews, reminded Parisians that hope was not gone. And in the quietest of moments, neighbours reached out. A loaf shared, a word of encouragement, a simple presence at someone's side. Fear shaped daily life, but it did not erase compassion. The city endured by holding on to small certainties, to the knowledge that even in silence and danger, Paris remained a place of human hearts. Hope in occupied Paris was fragile but persistent, a quiet ember that refused to go out. People spoke of it carefully, often in whispers, as though naming it too loudly might cause it to vanish. Hope took many forms: a rumour of Allied victories, a leaflet slipped under a door, a forbidden radio broadcast caught in the night. Even the smallest signs were enough to stir hearts. When bombers were heard far away, some felt fear, but others felt reassurance. It meant the outside world was still fighting, that liberation was not forgotten. Children carried hope without fully knowing it. Their laughter, their drawings, their questions about the future reminded adults why it was worth enduring. Parents told them stories of Paris before the war, describing streets filled with music and cafes alive with chatter. In these tales, the city lived freely, and children believed such days would return. For adults, hope often arrived through connection. A neighbour's kindness, a shared loaf of bread, or even a smile exchanged in a marketplace reminded them that they were not alone. These gestures carried enormous weight, proving that solidarity could outlast fear. Faith also nurtured hope. Churches lit candles through the darkest winters, their glow small but steady. Prayers were whispered not only for survival, but for change, for the day when bells would ring in freedom. People clung to rituals like Christmas or Easter, even with meagre meals and handmade gifts, because they symbolized continuity, the belief that life would not always be shadowed. Secretly, many followed the progress of the war. Though official papers told only of German victories, whispers suggested another story. When news reached Paris that Allied troops had landed in North Africa, hope stirred. When whispers spread of resistance elsewhere, hope grew stronger. Each rumour, true or not, added to the sense that time was moving forward. Artists too carried hope. Writers filled notebooks with words meant for the future. Painters captured scenes of familiar streets, as if to preserve them until light returned. Their works were rarely shown openly, but they were kept safe, testimonies of resilience for days ahead. In homes, parents told their children, "This will not last forever." In markets, people said quietly, "Someday things will change." These phrases, repeated in countless households, became mantras of survival. Hope did not erase fear or hunger, but it gave people the strength to carry on one more day. And in a city defined by beauty and spirit, hope was as essential as bread. It reminded Parisians that even in silence, their hearts were waiting for freedom's voice to return. As the war dragged on, the signs of change in Paris grew stronger, though they arrived slowly and often with uncertainty. Air raid sirens sometimes echoed through the city, sending families into cellars and basements. The distant sound of aircraft, the trembling of windows, reminded Parisians that battles were being fought beyond their walls. For some, these moments were terrifying, yet for others, they carried a strange comfort. Proof that the war was moving, that the world had not forgotten them. The occupiers strengthened their grip, but beneath the surface the city's spirit sharpened. The resistance grew bolder, and stories of sabotage spread quietly from ear to ear. Railway lines disrupted, messages smuggled, supplies stolen. These small acts became symbols of courage. Even for those not directly involved, hearing of them lifted hearts. Each tale whispered in markets or cafes became fuel for patience, a reminder that occupation was not permanent. German soldiers, though still present everywhere, no longer seemed untouchable. Their voices carried authority, but their expressions sometimes revealed weariness. Parisians noticed, and in those fleeting glimpses they sensed that the occupiers were not invincible. This subtle shift changed the atmosphere. People stood a little straighter, spoke with a touch more confidence, carried themselves with the knowledge that tides could turn. Food shortages, however, deepened. Bread was thinner, portions smaller, and even vegetables were hard to find. Yet endurance had become second nature. Families knew how to stretch meals, how to share, how to substitute. Hunger was part of life, but so too was resilience. Children, though thinner, still played, still dreamed, their laughter carrying through courtyards in defiance of the silence outside. Hope, once fragile, now grew louder in whispers. People dared to imagine liberation, to picture parades of joy in the streets. They spoke quietly of Allied forces advancing, of victories abroad, of the possibility that freedom might return. No one knew when, but the idea itself was enough to sustain them. Behind closed doors, families planned what they would do when the day came, meals they would cook, places they would visit, songs they would sing. These conversations were as nourishing as food. The city's landmarks, too, seemed to wait. The Eiffel Tower stood silent. The churches tolled their bells. The river flowed steadily. All carried the same message. Paris endured. And in its endurance it prepared for the moment when silence would finally break and the city could breathe freely once more. Liberation came to Paris in August 1944, after 4 long years of silence, scarcity and endurance. The news spread first in whispers, then in shouts, as people realized that the tide had finally reached their city. Allied forces were advancing, the resistance was rising, and the occupiers were beginning to falter. Barricades appeared in the streets, hastily built from carts, furniture and stones. The sounds of gunfire echoed through neighbourhoods, breaking the silence that had weighed on Paris for so long. For days tension filled the air, but it was a tension charged with hope rather than fear. Flags that had been hidden for years emerged from attics and cellars. Windows filled with the colours of France, as tricolours waved where once there had been none. People sang the Marseillaise openly, their voices strong, unafraid at last. Crowds gathered, cheering as resistance fighters moved through the streets, their courage no longer confined to whispers and hidden acts. And then, at last, Allied tanks rolled into Paris. The city that had endured in silence erupted in sound. Bells rang from churches, horns blared, voices shouted with joy. Strangers embraced in the streets, tears of relief and disbelief flowing freely. Children climbed onto vehicles, waving flags, while parents stood watching, unable to put their feelings into words. Paris was alive again, not in whispers but in shouts, in songs, in laughter that had been waiting for years to return. Yet liberation was not only joy. It carried sorrow too, for many had been lost. Families searched for loved ones who had disappeared. Neighbours mourned those who had not survived. The scars of occupation were deep, written into the memories of hunger, silence and fear. But alongside grief stood pride, the pride of endurance, of resilience, of a city that had refused to let its soul be broken. In the days that followed, celebrations filled the boulevards. Music returned to cafes, couples danced in the streets, and Parisians looked once more to the future. The Seine sparkled beneath the summer sun, carrying away the shadows of the past. The city was free, but more importantly, it was itself again. For those who had lived through occupation, the memories would never fade. They would remember the silence, the cues, the fear, but also the kindness, the resilience, the quiet acts of courage that had kept Paris alive. And as they stepped into the light of liberation, they knew that the city had not merely survived. It had endured. It had waited. and it had proven that even in the darkest times the spirit of Paris could never be extinguished.